The Church as Incubator, Oppressor, Motive Magazine, and Methodism in the Midst of Cultural Upheaval. I'm Dana Robert, Director of the Center for Global Christianity and Mission here at BU School of Theology. And in the spirit of the 1960s, I'd like to welcome you to our teach-in on Motive Magazine. Several years ago, we at the Center for Global Christianity, in conjunction with the SGH Library and with the support of Dean Moore, began to document the legacy of Motive Magazine. Now, the history of Motive and SGH are intertwined because the founding editor of Motive was Harold Ahrensberger, professor of religious drama at the School of Theology. As the official magazine of the Methodist student movement from 1941 to 1972, Motive influenced generations of SGH students. Its avant-garde mix of art, poetry, photography, and commentary on contemporary theological and political issues put it on the cutting edge of youth movements across several generations. Motive's fame reached its height in the 1960s under the dynamic editorship of B.J. Stiles. Its first issue after the assassination of President Kennedy was on death, with poetry, photography, artwork, and articles by such luminaries as Viktor Frankl, Paul Tillich, Jessica Mitford, and Bishop J.A.T. Robinson. In 1965, Motive was the single runner-up to Life magazine in the Columbia School of Journalism's Magazine of the Year. In 1966, Newsweek magazine called it, quote, the most creative and unfettered, close quote, magazine published by any denomination. True to its form as an avant-garde publication, its final issues in 1972 were a gay and a lesbian issue, the first of any magazine in North America. Here at STH, we're scanning Motive Magazine to make it widely available again. Our archives are the repository of the papers and paintings of Peg Rigg, who was artistic director of Motive in the 1960s. And in the spring, we hope to host an exhibit by Motive cartoonist Jim Crane. The Motive Project is part of our larger effort to recover the memory and tradition of mainline ecumenical missions. And I invite you to look at our website under SCM USA to see more about the work of B.J. Stiles on Motive, of Ada Foser on the Frontier in Mission Program, and the project In the Midst by Kathy Corman. To understand the importance of Motive as a focal point for the social issues of the 1960s, I need only quote from a 2007 interview with Paul Kengor, the author of God and Hillary Clinton, A Spiritual Life. So let me quote. It was during college that Hillary swallowed a large dose of the religious left, namely through a now-defunct magazine for college-age Methodists called Motive. Hillary devoured every issue. I still have every issue they sent me, she said in a 1994 interview. Kengor says, this was not the typical Christian publication aimed at college kids. It was founded in 1941 by a pacifist committed to the social gospel tradition. The magazine lurched further and further to the left throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, eventually becoming a magazine of the counterculture, where its pages were filled with a kind of who's who of radical Protestantism. I'm still quoting from this interview. The signal period of Motive's far-left drift came from 1961 to 1969 under the leadership of its fourth editor, B.J. Stiles. During this period, the magazine's special targets were the Vietnam War, anti-communism, and American economic imperialism, especially alleged U.S. evildoings in Latin America. Hillary particularly recalls an article by Methodist theologian Carl Oglesby called Change or Containment, which had the important effect of pushing her further against U.S. policy in Southeast Asia. For the record, says Kangor, Oglesby was no run-of-the-mill Methodist pacifist. He was an early founder and eventual president of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. In the pages of Motive, Oglesby asked questions like, what would be so wrong about a Vietnam run by Ho Chi Minh? Or a Cuba by Castro? Close quote. That's a quote from the interview. So that gives you a taste of the magazine that we're going to look at today, especially in that later period of the 1960s under the editorship of B.J. Stiles. Our first panelist today is Ada Foser, who is part-time research director of the Center for Global Christianity and Mission. She is a doctoral student here at Boston University, and her dissertation topic is Right Relations and the Student Christian Movement in the United States. She tries to explain what happened to the important mainline Protestant tradition during the Cold War. Ada came to Boston University after a significant career in inner-city community development, then as the Massachusetts Deputy Commissioner of Banks in the mid-1980s, and finally as an investigative business reporter and economics editor. Originally from Pittsburgh, she holds her Master of Divinity from the Boston University School of Theology. So let us welcome Ada today.
Well, unlike the other panelists this afternoon, I actually came to the Motive Project and to the Student Christian Movement from outside. I was not a participant as a college student. I never saw Motive magazine as a college student, but I was not outside the mainline Protestant world, and am old enough to remember that kind of stuff, as you can see by my slightly graying hair. And like many of us, had lingering questions about what in the hell happened. And none of the explanations that generally got currency seemed to make any sense to me. Then, fast forward to 2006, I was a student in Dr. Roberts' Women in Mission class, and she assigned a new book called Journeys That Opened Up the World. Well, hold it up there, by Sarah Evans, edited by Sarah Evans, and comprised of 16 chapters written by 16 women active in the student Christian movement during the 50s and 60s. In that book, I discovered motive in the stories of these women, and I also discovered the Frontier Internship in Mission program, which I'm doing my dissertation on. 4 of the 16 women had been participants. So I wrote a paper on motive, and then I proceeded to find and interview 125 people who had participated in the Frontier Internship and Mission program. So I'm going to give you a couple of highlights from my work. It's a brief period of time this morning, so I can't do any more than that, but it will contextualize a little bit what subsequent speakers will be talking about. First, the Frontier Internship and Mission interviews. Who were these people? Like some of our speakers and also the Journeys contributors, they were generally born in the 1930s and 40s. 60% were small town or farm people. The 20% that were suburban were the youngest ones. They were evenly dispersed from around the country. They were broadly middle class, and that means maybe their dad owned a gas station, or maybe their dad was a corporate vice president, and everything in the middle, which comprised that large middle class from that era. They went to 68 different colleges and universities. They were leaders. But they were not the socioeconomic elite. We're not talking, country club, Protestant establishment, Harvard kids here. Nor are we talking about people from what we would think of as the blue states or whatever. All across America, small towns and farms. Their journeys did not start when they got corrupted in college. Their journeys that opened up the world started at home. An overwhelming number of the frontier interns, FIs they call themselves, had parents, Sunday school teachers, ministers, family friends, and neighbors who were themselves open to the world. Their values had a strong emphasis on education and responsible citizenship, which was part of the tradition. Ecumenical themes like the responsible society filtered down to their local church and to them. They generally supported the United Nations, the World Council of Churches. There was a huge impact from the mission history. Visiting missionaries, former missionaries living in the community, mission societies who sponsored international students for holidays, study groups, news from churches around the world in church publications. So it was easy to be a kid in Clarinda, Iowa, and feel very connected to people on the other side of the world. The impact of the student Christian movement was pervasive. It was a worldwide network. The FIs were already networked domestically. The Frontier Intern Program attached them to it internationally. They went to 48 different countries, almost all in the third world. They were bound together by a shared culture, a way of being Christian that does not factor into any of the ways that we typically talk about Protestant Christianity. Not liberal, not conservative, not fundamentals, not moderns, not any of those things. It was a way of living that consisted of a commitment to shared practices. Devotion, deliberation, study, and service across boundaries of disagreement and difference. The result was new insights and social innovation, independent thought. Also solidarity. The impact of the global Cold War being waged secretly, quote unquote, in emerging new nations was also pervasive, as was their moral revulsion. Returned volunteers' attempts to witness to what they had learned were rejected. They often were rejected. The open churches of their childhoods had closed up. Briefly, what explains this change? I will give you a quick answer: fear. Our colleague here at BU, Andrew Basevich, has explained it this way. People had been told and believed that the United States was a country under siege, that only hard power and overt and covert action to combat communism all over the world could save it, and that any criticism or any pressure for any change at home aided the enemy. They, these young people, were aiding the enemy. A 1973 study of Presbyterians by sociologist Dean Hogue found that people who feel threatened want the church to provide a safe haven and oppose changes that might increase the threat. Motive was gave crucial input to these young people. Sociologist Ann Swidler, in her classic article, Culture in Action, theorizes that people use their cultural toolboxes to construct strategies of action, to figure out what to do. Motive puts stuff in the toolboxes of these young frontier interns. The student Christian movement generally had been doing that for decades, feeding resources into these practices of devotion, deliberation, study, and service. Motive was full of good stuff for them to chew on, and that was its purpose. They had filled cultural toolboxes. They had material that was like a 7-course meal. Martin Marty in 1959 sort of figures out what was going on with the mainline churches, and he criticizes them for contributing to the patternized life of prosperous groupings. He warns the dangers to theological freedom in a time of organizational conformity. And he says, quote, "Student magazines like Motive, though they sometimes lapse into faddish criticisms of conformity, have set the pace." The undertow was always there. However, our panelists will tell us more about this, but it grew stronger as the violence in American society grew stronger, and hopelessness began to seep in. Essentially, from 1965 to 1970, from the pages of the magazine, a confidence that we can overcome is replaced by maybe not. The bottom line is this generation felt like they'd lost the custody battle for the church. And many also felt they lost ownership of and access to the faith. In 1973, William Stringfellow said, "We should have had a Barmen Declaration." And that, I think, is probably a good clip to, so I'll start there.
It will be my pleasure now to introduce Mr. B.J. Stiles, who will moderate the rest of the speaking part of the panel. As you see in your program, B.J. Stiles is a nonprofit leader and has made significant contributions in publishing and communication and civil and human rights. In the 1960s, he was editor-in-chief of Motive magazine, the official publication of the Methodist student movement that featured many leaders and religious voices. After urging Robert F. Kennedy to run for president, BJ was invited to join the staff, and at the request of the family, launched the RFK Fellows Program for the Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Center for Human Rights. He served as deputy chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities during the administration of President Jimmy Carter, and vice president of communications for the Council on Foundations. As awareness of AIDS dramatically exploded in the early 1980s, Stiles became a consultant and freelance writer and was widely cited in news accounts of the impact of the epidemic on business and labor. He was recognized by George W. Bush in a speech delivered in Washington, D.C. in March of 1990 for his creative work in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. In 1987, BJ founded the National Leadership Coalition on AIDS, and served as its president or CEO until that organization merged with the National Community AIDS Partnership in 1997 to form the National AIDS Fund. He served as the fund's president until his retirement in 1999. Since then, he has served as interim executive director for several Bay Area nonprofits, including the AIDS and Breast Cancer Emergency Fund, Operation Access, and the Stop AIDS Project. So we have a legend in our midst today, and I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming Mr. B.J. Stiles.
If my mother were still alive, she wouldn't believe that you're talking about me, David. I have 2 adult daughters, and I am with my grandchildren and with their friends, and they talk a little bit about some of this data. Privately, both daughters will say, "Dad, what are you going to be when you grow up?" I decided I'm not growing up, because the journey really isn't finished. And as grateful and excited as I am today about BUSTH inviting some of us to reflect and share, I'm really excited about it because today is about tomorrow. These are really interesting experiences and legacies. But we're not here to talk about trying to resurrect them. We're trying to find in our shared experience what led each of us to be who we are and do what we did, in order that we will continue to be as engaged in the survival of our planet, in the restitution of civility in our society, and the expansion of justice for all. That's what I hope this afternoon is about, and we invite you to endure a few more minutes of our sharing of our experiences. But after that coffee break, which I'm sure we'll all eagerly await, Dana, we hope to have a really interesting dialogue with each of you. Let me end that by saying I am profoundly humbled by the leadership of the school in viewing the work of the student movements, plural, and the work of Motive Magazine as an opportunity not just to protect an important legacy, but as an opportunity to bring that legacy alive into the curricula, the social experiences, and the lives of students, faculty, and alums. Of course, like almost anything that is really risk-taking and innovative, it isn't created by a committee. It may be sustained by a committee, a board of directors, a power structure, but those enterprises come about through the accidental willingness or the intentional function of someone who is determined to challenge the status quo and is open-minded about how to do so in a way that will bring other people into that enterprise. Motive was created exactly in that context. In 1938, when the 3 independent Methodist denominations, the Methodist Episcopal Church North, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Methodist Episcopal Church, felt that they had far more to accomplish and share as a unified Methodist denomination family as opposed to 3 standing separate and sometimes quite differing and sometimes bickering denominations. When the hierarchy, both elected and chosen, of the 3 denominations put together that planning process, it was also agreed that voices within each denomination should be instrumental and be listened to in terms of what programmatic functions might stem from the United Church. There had been almost a full decade of really innovative leadership in the Northern Church and the Southern Church, addressing young people from mid-school up through high school in the formation of the Methodist Youth Fellowship. There had been an equally strong, powerful, and reasonably well-funded commitment to college and university students in Methodist colleges and universities in the form of a chaplaincy or a religion program, and in the secular institutions in the presence of a Wesley Foundation. Those institutions had a remarkable vitality, and as Ada noted in her survey, where did these people come from? Little bitty towns and very small farms and ranches throughout this country. These organizations brought the world into our churches, our lives, and took many of us outside that parish into significant undertakings called national quadrennial conferences, summer work camps, caravan programs that, as Ada indicated, really did expose us to the men and women and the issues far beyond our thinking and far beyond our territory. When BU suggested that we all might dwell a bit of time this afternoon together and invited me to try to assemble a panel and provide a framework, Mr. Carp kept saying, well, BJ, what are you going to call it? I need a title. We have to print something. And I kind of didn't really cooperate very helpfully. And I guess in the proverbial shower one morning, it occurred to me, I need to be able to express my own experiences with the church. And for most of my young adult childhood and young adult lifetime, the church was absolutely an incubator. Now, I'm a farm boy from a tenant farm in Texas in the 1930s, and I came to know about incubators because that's where my parents went to buy 50 little chicks to grow them into edible food. And an incubator was a machine in the back of somebody's farm store in which fertile eggs were placed and controlled, and out popped these chicks. It startled me a few years ago when Steve and I live in San Francisco, and that's just north of Silicon Valley, where they do some things like Chatter and Twitter and all of that stuff. And that's what I began to read in the Wall Street Journal, that this is where America's technology was being incubated. Well, incubated really in that context means that's where the brain power formed. That's where the energy of young, radical, aggressive, brilliant people from around the world assembled in order to create, to share, to sell, to grow. It's not at all difficult, I think, for any of us this afternoon to celebrate the times in our childhood and adolescence, and maybe most of our adult life, in which the church, and I use it with a small c, though I'm basically speaking about our experiences in the Methodist Church, similar to Presbyterians United Church, etc. We have experienced the church as a training ground, as a learning opportunity, as a builder of leadership, a builder of communities. All of those organizations that I mentioned are just the examples of what we were invited to participate in. I thought there has to be the flip side of the coin. If the church has been and still is an incubator, what's the reverse? I studied with a lot of terms, and I finally had to look at myself in the mirror and say the flip side for me is the church is an oppressor. Whether intentionally or not, whether theologically or sociologically or pragmatically is its cause. I have also experienced church, lowercase c, capital UMC, and the global church, has been a negator of racial groups, of women, of gays and lesbians and bisexuals, and goodness knows the number of people around the world that our church has intentionally put into prison camps because they were an ethnic group that was fighting us. Heaven knows how many of our brothers and sisters have died in Latin America and in Africa, the Philippines, and elsewhere because they were standing up for civil and human and gender rights. I don't want to be overly harsh or judgmental. I respect the complexity of leaders, be they academic or religious. But it appalls me, I can't think of a stronger word, it appalls me that in the crises our society has experienced, we do not have the voices and vision of leadership similar to what informed us in the 40s and the 50s and the personhood of the leaders of our council and bishops. Their names are all around this campus. As I waited and waited for a statement from somebody, be he or she religious, interfaith, denominational, to speak with clarity about the recent shutdown in our government and our lives, which is really a shutdown of our economy and the messages that behavior is sending around the world. We will pay a price for that dearly. I don't want to harp on the church as oppressor, but I would be less than honest than if I didn't say it has been oppressive. When I finally, late middle age, came to understand that though married happily so, though successfully a parent of children and a grandfather, I'm gay. I've been gay all my life. And yet the structure of my family, my church, my society was such that I could never, ever accept it. And as I began to deal with my own life situation, I turned to mentors, many of whom were my age or even younger, to ask, how does one come out? How do you express to others what you're feeling as a prisoner of your body and as a traitor to your society? Without exception, they all said, you gotta start with you. You look in the mirror and say, who am I and how can I be and express myself openly, lovingly, graciously to people I care about. A few years ago, a journalist friend in Washington, in trying to introduce me to some of her friends, looked at me and said, amidst the kind of accolades she was spieling out, she looked at me and she said, well, BJ, when did you leave the church? And immediately I said, I've never left the church. The church left me. I'm coming back to that part of my life, in part thanks to this institution and thanks to the other people who are here today. Nevertheless, at the end of 8 years of extraordinarily successful editing and publishing, the last issue of Motive magazine never saw the light of day. It literally was pulled physically from the presses of the Methodist Publishing House by my bosses and their peers. I can't think of a more tangible evidence of the negativity of feeling that one has the authority and the necessity to intervene in freedom of speech, freedom of behavior, creativity. It hurts still when Ada and I were in Tampa last year interviewing that wonderful cartoonist Jim Crane, who's very much alive. And Jim began to talk about his hurt, about how we have treated him personally and as a cartoonist. He never got paid, he never really got recognized. He gave us his brilliance, his humor, his insight willingly and freely. And Jim, at the end of that, looked at me and said, well, BJ, you'd never understand what I'm talking about. I said, Jim, if somebody pulled together your best art, your best insight to human society in a one-man show, and in all of that exhibit, there was one particular piece that you're so proud of. And suddenly somebody runs in from the street and grabs it and takes it out and stomps on it and throws kerosene on it and burns it. How would you feel? Jim said, oh, I guess you do understand. It's not that any of these anecdotes need be definitive, but unless you and I wake up, speak up, shout out, think, and encourage others to do the same, this will be repeated. Thank you so much, and it will be fun to have dialogue with you after the Q&A. I'm thrilled that fellow panelists this afternoon are two of your distinguished alums of this institute. And I specifically wanted them to participate because in their middle and later years, in addition to a lifelong vigorous leadership in the parish, in the Methodist Church, and various other sectors, each has taken on a new mission for themselves. Gil, I can't tell you how much you have encouraged me to believe that there are your peers throughout this denomination who are ready to address gay and lesbian rights as strongly and as successfully as together we have faced civil rights. And Don, you and I have known each other through a fair number of battles, including when you supported George McGovern for president and I supported Bobby Kennedy for president, amicably. When you spoke up on your own, but with your credentials as an ordained, highly respected Methodist, when you began to speak up about stigma and discrimination in HIV, I believe that my church was finally joining the fight. And I hope Tom will share some of that with you this afternoon. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to our dialogue with you.
Thank you very much, BJ, for those words. I thought I was going to, when I stood up, provide an imitation of Senator Mark Rubio. Do you remember when he had his water nearby? And I had a bottle of water somewhere that disappeared. If someone could maybe bring some water, just leave it there, I would appreciate that very, very much. It's just great to be here. There are many memories as I return to my alma mater, Boston University School of Theology. But particularly today, and particularly in this place downstairs. I finished this school in 1958. And in May of 1958, I, with other student leaders, invited Martin Luther King to come to his alma mater. And I will remember that downstairs here, and I believe it was then a refectory, we sat together with Martin King. We had a picture taken. I believe the late Angelo Mungiora, who was responsible for that picture. I should have brought it today. But there, downstairs, here, we had a chance to be with him. And so, thanks for that memory, and thanks for a lot of other things. I guess I want to begin with our theme to remind you of a kind of a statement or something we've heard or we've said many times, that the church is not a rest home for saints. but it is a hospital for sinners. As I thought about that, I think, of course, there was a time when the whole word hospital meant, of course, hospitality. But how many of you know that hospitals also are places of infection? Places of infection. Grace and I, my wife of 55 years, can talk about that, for she, some years ago, had an operation in Denver that some people here know about. And as she was in that process, something happened in terms of the anesthetics, and therefore her life was at risk. And then 13 years ago, when I was then pastor of Park Hill United Methodist Church, I tell the story with some humor that I was sitting in a meeting of the staff parish relations committee there at that church, and all of a sudden my face froze up, and I could not speak well, and they took me to the hospital, and I've said to people after that that's a marvelous way of ending a staff parish relations committee meeting. But it was discovered that I had a brain tumor, and so I had the first operation, and then it was discovered that I developed an infection, and so I had to return to the hospital for a second operation to deal with the infection. And because of that, that's why I walk with a cane today. Our one granddaughter calls me Papa Cane because of there is nerve damage. But I guess that's sort of what I wanted to talk about in terms of how we understand the church. Harvey Cox has said some interesting things. It's interesting in old age that you find yourself picking up books that you've forgotten about. They're sort of on the shelf. And Harvey Cox, how many of you know his book on not leaving it to the snake? Some of you know that. And I just wanted to read something from that to see, as we engage in conversation later on, if any of that has some relevance. For this sort of jumped out at me as I was preparing for this event. He says, of course, this, and I hope you will help me later on fit this in. He says that he, of course, was talking about faith. He says, I think it is wrong and dangerous for the church to continue to pound away at pride as a tragic human flaw to make it a virtue of dependency. What I want to say about faith and decision is something different. We are summoned to make our own decisions. To shove them off on someone else, either the snake or on God or the church, is a betrayal of our personhood. True, the Bible and the Christian tradition are alive with ethical insights and moral wisdom. They are misused, however, if they are made to function as eternal, applicable canons that excuse us from the frightful responsibility of renewing and reconstructing our moral tradition in the light of unprecedented issues our forebears never had to confront: the bomb, the computer, the pill. Would anybody say amen to that? That helps deal with how we understand the Bible at first. I believe a careful examination of the biblical sources will indicate that our most, and by the way, Harvey in this book uses man, and I'm trying at first to translate his man and make it inclusive, so I will do that first. But he is saying it is not our attempt to be a person. Rather, he says that it is our sloth. It's unwillingness, our unwillingness to be everything that we were intended to be. Our moral discoloration stems only in part from our unwillingness to be sorry for the wrong we have done in the past. It stems even more from our unwillingness to take responsibility for what we will do in the future. I wanted to share those words from Harvey, and then let me just simply talk about my own experience. One experience, I guess, as church, as even in its incubation responsibility, as well as its oppression, being something that's negative, being, if you would, a kind of infection. Now, of course, I know it's racism best. On this coming Monday, I will celebrate my 80th birthday. And so, therefore, I've been around for a long time. And I'm just talking about the churches as I remember it. I was, I guess, 5 years of age when my father went to that unification conference in Kansas City, when those three branches of Methodism merged. Here was a church that had been involved in discussing and fighting the whole issue of slavery, some for, some against, and then deciding to unify. But in the process of unification, decided that even though the debate over slavery may have ended, when we come together as a Methodist church, we will develop and create a separate racial identity jurisdiction, the central jurisdiction. And therefore, that was an interesting kind of beginning. My father was at that conference, and my preacher father, and though of course I was young, it just seems to me later on, as he and I talked about my ministry, he sort of shared with me his own discouragement, as he of course was a part of that experience. So that of course was one of the things that represents of course church's infection. Then my mother, Julia Brown Caldwell, she was active in the central jurisdiction. She represented the central jurisdiction on the women's division of the Board of Missions. My mother would come back from those meetings and at the dinner table would talk about how she, of course, enjoyed those meetings, but how so often she would discover that there was a restaurant in which she could not eat because of her race. There were hotels in which she could not stay, simply because of her race. And so, of course, how that was painful. But then she was able to celebrate the fact that there were people. A name that I was talking about, Thelma Stevens, a wonderful Southern woman who said that whenever, my mother said that whenever that happened, Thelma would stand with me. And if in fact they asked me to leave, she would leave with me. And so that of course was a marvelous kind of story. And I guess in a sense I would suggest that whatever prophetic kinds of things I've done, particularly in terms of sort of cutting through some racial boundaries, I would say that my mother was responsible. So I guess I would say that she sort of encouraged, that's the Rubio move, isn't it? Yes. Move over and get my water. She encouraged me to become involved in the North Carolina Methodist student movement. And so as I became involved in that movement as a student at North Carolina A&T State University, I in fact became a member of the board of the North Carolina Methodist student movement. I became involved in a movement where there were some churches in North Carolina where we could not meet. And then when we went to Junaluska for our regular meetings, I discovered that as excited as I was about the Methodist student movement, we were in a place where I had to stay in segregated housing and could not use the recreational kinds of things. I remember very well an interesting kind of moment that was sort of bittersweet. I remember enjoying sitting in on a board meeting, and I was very pleased that my fellow board members decided that we, when we go to Lake Junaluska this time, will not at all participate in the recreational facilities. We, Gil, will sort of be in solidarity with you. And so I was excited. That here my white colleagues said that they were going to stand with me over against the racial segregation of Lake Junaluska. We arrived there a day early, and I discovered that my friends had decided that they would get there a day early, so they could swim, so they could take advantage of the facilities. And then when the conference began officially, then they would follow their resolution. That of course, had its impact upon me, you can imagine. But I remember just the excitement. There was a guy named Harold Hips. Does anybody know that name, Harold Hips? Who was a leader of MSN. Just a wonderful guy who was so very helpful. And I think it's because of my mother that as I sort of realized that I had this call to ministry. I first received it when I was a student at Samuel Houston College in Austin, Texas, and then we moved to North Carolina. But I said that I don't want to go to Gammon because my father went to Gammon, and my father was a much better student than I was. I didn't want to try to walk in his shoes, and so I said, well, why not apply to the Methodist school in my home state of North Carolina? And so I applied to Duke Divinity School. It must have been about 1954. And of course, they sent me the letter indicating that unfortunately their trustees had not changed their policies. But I will never forget, and I wish I still had that letter, I will never forget that they said that we hope you will find a seminary to meet your needs. And I guess, thank goodness, that became Boston University School of Theology. I guess what I'm saying about the church, both in its incubation responsibilities as well as the reality of its oppression, that somehow the church has not done enough in terms of dealing with the roots of its isms. Whether one is talking about anti-Semitism, whether one is talking about sexism, racism, or heterosexism. I find some of you know this prayer. I used to hear it in my dad's churches over and over again. That sort of is related maybe to the black church, but I'm sure it's picked up in other churches. But the person who would pray, Lord, I'm not what I ought to be. God, I'm not what I'm going to be, but God, I thank you, I'm not what I used to be. I don't hear that from the church. We've not found a way as the church to collectively acknowledge that in terms of our interpretation, we were wrong. In terms of our theology that justified these isms, we were wrong, etc., etc., that we have moved from that. But and you can help me in the discussion. How we know we have at General Conference these celebrations, not celebrations, but simply repentance. But I find myself asking, has the church really looked at itself and been able to say that we were wrong and others were right? And that's why this whole process, this whole seminar is so important. It's as though the church has some difficulty with celebrating its evolution. It's as though if, in fact, we fess up to the fact that we have changed from this to that somehow we will disown the Scriptures, that in fact we will be antithetical to what we understand about the unchanging nature of Scripture. And yet the fact of the matter is that we know that though the Bible, Scripture has not changed, we have changed. Another aspect of my journey is even in my name. I am named for Gilbert Haven, Bishop Gilbert Haven. That white Methodist 19th century, I believe, preacher who was so much ahead of his time. He, of course, was simply very proponent of racial integration, but he also was a proponent of interracial marriage. And I found myself sort of remembering him as I've been a proponent of same-sex marriage. But here I am, my father was named Gilbert Haven also, because Gilbert Haven was known within the black community. And so we celebrate that name, but then my last name is Caldwell. And Caldwell is the name of the slave owners who owned our family. And so you can see therefore that there's that kind of tension. And you realize that in fact church was involved in support of that. But then I say that in terms of sexism, I guess my own sensitization to issues of sexism came because again of my mother, because I had the feeling that if my mother had been able to be ordained, she would have been. She had the kind of quality, she had the kind of love of people, she had the kind of brave, bold, and bodaciousness that would have made her an effective pastor. And so that person is in terms of how I've been shaped in terms of that issue. And the whole matter of heterosexism. I don't remember a moment, but I remember that in 1980 I was a part of a colloquy on homosexuality that appeared in Circuit Rider. And so I had an article in that. And as I look back at that article, I realized how untutored I was, because I found myself talking about sexual preference rather than orientation as I wrote that. But nevertheless, that was one of the ways that I was involved. I found myself, of course, very involved in the Methodist Federation for Social Action, our men, etc., etc. I was involved in church within a church. And then I found myself having church within a church visit Black Methodists for church renewal. That was an interesting experience for me. I would say in this setting that some of the most vicious mail that I've gotten, certainly I received that during my days in the Civil Rights Movement, but receiving almost that same kind of mail from one or two or three of my black colleagues in terms of my support of gay rights. It is just amazing. And then as I became involved, I got involved in the United Methodists of Color for a fully inclusive church. And then in 2000 at the Cleveland General Conference, I was arrested twice. Some of you know about that. So I've had 4 arrests because of civil disobedience. In 1971, I was arrested in New York with Jesse Jackson and others because A&P supermarkets had some issues in terms of employment. Then I was arrested, I think, in 1985, that outside the South African embassy protesting apartheid. But then I was arrested in 2000. I see you're remembering that.
The first 2 I was arrested too.
Okay, that's right, exactly. I was arrested twice at the General Conference. First with Soul Force outside, and then led by Greg Dell. There were 29 of us who went on the floor of the conference and got arrested also. I find myself wondering, hoping that in 2016, the church will have moved a lot, that there will be some acknowledgement of the fact that in the year 2000, some of us were arrested, etc., etc. I was going to read something, but I will not do that in terms of this whole idea of the prophetic. I was interested in the bishop last night talking about the prophetic tradition. But let me just say that as we wrestle today with our topic, you remember Martin Luther King raised the question, why is it that the church so often is a taillight rather than a headlight on justice issues? It seems to me that that's part of the theme of what we're about. And I guess my hope is that somehow we might find ways to help the church be the church. I wrote something, and I write frequently. Some of you know, and you receive my unsolicited stuff. There is one person in this room who always or frequently sends a kind of thank you. I don't know whether in that thank you she is saying, yes, thank you, Gil, but don't send me anything else. That's not true as a married husband. But be that as it may, I find myself, as I do that, making that a kind of, each time I sit at my computer, I say something like this, I remember, Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me, fill me, use me, etc. And that sort of shapes my writing. And Grace will tell you that one of the things that I find myself doing is reading over and over again stuff that I've written. And she asked me why. Don't you know what you wrote? Why do you read it? And I guess I have to confess that some of what I've written, often I've written stuff that I had no idea from whence it came. And therefore, that is why I just sort of am surprised by what I write. I close with these words. I heard a sermon not too long ago by a Baptist preacher, a gifted Baptist preacher. He used something from Job that I'd not heard before. He talked about the scent of water. Have any of you preached on that portion in the book of Job, the scent of water? I'm going to finish by reading this to you. And by the way, Don Messer is a good longtime friend of ours. Don served as an assistant at Union Methodist Church when I was pastor. If you ever need a leader of gangs in your community, Don is great, because at that point when he was with us back there, he developed a relationship with a group called the Grand Dukes, right? And Don was just effective there. But what I'm doing is that, and he does not know this, I'm reading, Bonnie, from a book that belongs to Don. This is the Bible. I happened to be in your office and needed a Bible, and you let me borrow it, and I stole it. and I've had it. I've had it. And so I want to simply finish with these words, because it just seems to me that if you substitute church for a tree, this whole idea, one does not smell water, and yet the writer talks about the scent of water. And I guess I am suggesting that possibly, rather than water, we could talk about the Holy Spirit. For one of the things that is needed is for us to have roots that are deep enough to sort of plug into what God wants us to do. And if in fact we do that, then we would reshape not only the incubation, but also the oppression that is within the church. So hear these words. For there is hope for a tree If it is cut down, that it will sprout again, and that its shoots will not cease. Though its roots grow old in the earth, and its stump dies in the ground, yet at the scent of water, it will, like a bud, put forth branches like a young plant. My hope is that the church somehow in a new day may sort of smell the scent of the power of water, the power of the Holy Spirit, so that we might become a transformed church. Don, come and get your Bible.
Embarrassing to know how many years ago I lost it and didn't know it. Actually, Dean Roberts told us before we came in that we'll have a break for coffee, but we as participants need to know that people will disappear if we give them a break, but we'll give you a break. I'm going to take a risk and ask you to stand for a minute here. I think you probably would like to stand before I say a word, with the risk of losing you, right? Okay? I appreciate the opportunity and invitation of B.J. Stiles, the Boston University, to be here today. And it's been somewhat of a journey of self-discovery for me as I listened to my colleagues speak and as I prepared, because I realized that that very period when B.J. Stiles was seeking to mold the minds of young students from 61 to 69. He was subtly shaping my mind. That's my years, from 61 to 69, right? First in South Dakota, and then here at Boston University. So I guess I didn't know what was happening by these powerful figures and how they were helping to shape the movement and our lives. The issues that you mentioned, the research you've done, made me laugh because I thought I was so unique. And when you say people came from small towns, and I come from about as small a town as you can come from, middle South Dakota, 1,000 people. My parents were farmers and small town business people, and that's where I am. So, your research has made me learn about myself. Thank you. So, in my remarks, I'd like to begin by saying, what if Motive magazine had not been banned, and United Methodism still had a publication fearless in championing human rights for all people in the world? What if for the last 40 years, United Methodism had dared to present alternative and controversial perspectives that sometimes ran contrary to the established social teachings of the discipline of the United Methodist Church? What if the Methodist student movement had not voted itself out of existence? Would the current generation of laity and clergy be leading justice and human rights movements both within the church as well as within the global society? Or would it have made no difference, and we would still have America's second largest Protestant denomination mute, or worse yet, regressive on key social issues? Years ago, when visiting China, a friend purchased a calligraphy that he cherished. It read, "The pen is mightier than the sword. Never argue with someone who buys ink by the barrel." To silence the voice of Motive magazine, it was necessary to stop the presses and the publication. But the damage had already been done to some of us. For the editors, writers, and artists had already deeply influenced a generation of student readers with a prophetic gospel perspective of justice, equality, and freedom for all persons, male and female, black and white, gay, straight, U.S. and global. I was interested in reading the background and learned that a young youth minister in suburban Illinois, by the name of Don Jones, later to become a professor at Drew University, had given a high school graduating student a subscription to Motive magazine. That young graduating high school student was Hillary Clinton. Years later, as has been noted, former First Lady and now former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, claims she still had every copy that had been sent to her. As I said, this is a journey of self-discovery. That same youth minister, Don Jones, had been my first high school counselor at a youth camp at Lake Ponset in South Dakota. And he opened this small town country boy to a new world of ideas and a new understanding of Christian theology in today's world. Now, if I still remembered how to do a sociology of knowledge that my Boston University School of Theology mentors, Walter Milner and Paul Dietz, had taught me, I'd be able to explain why Miss Clinton became a world-famous leader and I ended up toiling in the backyards of United Methodism. But I don't know how to do that. Regardless, BJ was kind enough to invite me to share a bit of my story, how I've experienced both the church as Incubator and Oppressor. As an educated, married white male in the United States, I have personally known considerable privilege and very little deprivation or oppression. I have had opportunities, however, to walk and work closely with those who have felt and still feel the oppression of both church and society. My liberating education began at least in two places. First of all, through the Methodist Youth Fellowship and the Methodist Student Movement. It was somewhere when you were writing those Motive magazines, and an advertisement appeared about going for a study abroad. And I took off my junior year to India. Why I left the prairies of South Dakota to go to India, why I did this, I had never been able to figure it out. Particularly when I got there and discovered that they eat rice every day and no meat and potatoes, like I do. And I didn't even like rice. So just one of the many discoveries of life. But in that year in India, I participated in the student Christian movement, the broader movement, and met a friend, M. Samuel. We worked together. He was a year younger. For 35 years after I left, we didn't hear from each other. I knew nothing about him. We had no contact whatsoever. Went back in 1995. I said, maybe I could find him. People at Ross Christian College asked me, do I know anyone? I said, maybe he's a doctor. He wanted to be a doctor. The Dean of Women said, well, his son registered last week. I came to a room that night and discovered that he was working on HIV and AIDS. And that he had spent a lifetime working on leprosy around the world and was now a medical professor as well as a medical doctor. And then the second place, besides the Methodist Youth Fellowship and the Methodist Student Movement, was right here at Boston University School of Theology, where I chose to come. I was working here for 3 years with Dr. Gil Caldwell, First Union United Methodist Church, and the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination. It helped open my eyes to racism, segregation, and discrimination. Being assigned to raise money to rent buses for the 2 busloads of students who went from this seminary to Selma, Alabama, began my fundraising career. I'd never raised a dime before, but I discovered you can raise money if you believe in a cause. And it started an unexpected consequence. Walking arm in arm with the oppressed in Selma taught me to face fear and to experience hope in the midst of oppression. Another step of that journey was being trained here in Boston to be a nonviolent bodyguard for Martin Luther King, and they came here to protest the segregated schools and segregated housing system. Opposition to America's involvement in the Vietnam War led many of us seminarians to go and march and protest around Fenway Park when President Lyndon B. Johnson was speaking. Now, while we prided ourselves in this very seminary for the seminary's ethos of liberty, justice, and equality, we were pretty proud of ourselves for our stances on civil rights. We were still very limited in our understanding of liberation. We gladly participated in seminary singers without protesting the exclusion of women. Wasn't even discussed. And during my 6 years of master's and doctoral studies, I had only one woman professor and never a dean. During my graduate studies in social ethics, both here and at Harvard, from 63 to 69, I never remember a single academic discussion about environmental ethics, much less equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons. We don't always see everything happening around us. Life took some unexpected and quick turns for me after I left Boston University. After I got my PhD and headed back to be an associate pastor, trying to hopefully be a senior pastor of a church or be a professor. And within 2 years, I suddenly discovered myself as president of the university at the age of 30, with a whole new set of responsibilities. I probably didn't even know that the student Christian movement or Methodist had voted itself out of existence. I was kind of caught up in a whole new world. Instead of being on the outside of power, protesting, I suddenly found myself on the inside of power, highly vulnerable to criticism and controversy myself, in danger of protecting the status quo. For the next 29 years, I served as the university and seminary president, trying to be prophetic on social and public issues, while at the same time bearing responsibility for managing and maintaining institutions. As president, I did keep a print of Robert Hodgell's Prodigal Son on my wall as a reminder, probably to remind myself that I was a prodigal son and that I was also to be a loving father and administrator. In the early 1980s, I was asked to preach at a PFLAG conference focused on a new emerging disease while I was in Denver. Realizing my knowledge and my experience, again, was very limited, I approached my good friend, Reverend Charlie Earhart of the Metropolitan Community Church, the only church in Denver that was really reaching out to the gay and lesbian community, and asking for help. And he arranged for me to visit 6 gay men who were dying with HIV. No one was living with it at that time in the hospital. And these men helped me to write my sermon. They graciously shared with me the kind of stigma and pain they were experiencing, the kind of hopes that they had, because they were profoundly Christian men of hope. They believed a cure was around the corner. They believed God was with them. So whether I was more influenced by the pages of Motive, the Gospels of the New Testament, the Methodist student emphasis on inclusion, the philosophical theology of Boston personalism, or a combination of all these and other influences, I do not know. But nothing upsets or infuriates me more than the exclusion and stigmatization of other human beings. This emphasis on the worth and dignity of all human beings, I believe, was implanted deeply in the pages of Motive magazine, and has influenced my efforts to engage the church in the effort to end HIV and AIDS in our world. It's helped me understand how the church has helped to fuel widespread disease, despair, and death because of its homophobic perspectives, sexual inhibitions, moralistic judgments, and less than really caring approach. From the early 1980s until the present day, the United Methodist Church, of which I am a member of the clergy, has refused to mobilize its power and influence to address the pandemic. In 2000, I created the Center for the Church and Global AIDS. And in the opening of my 2004 book, Breaking the Conspiracy of Silence, Christian Churches and the Global AIDS Crisis, I noted that if only HIV had been caused by the bite of a mosquito, the church would have been in the front of finding a solution. In the same year, I was able to get the United Methodist Church to establish the Methodist Global AIDS Fund against the wishes of the powers that be that generate our church's leadership. It was good news in 2008, just 4 years later, when the United Methodist Church declared itself it was making global health a priority. The diseases of poverty were to be a priority in our church. That's good news. And what has evolved is a superb campaign to curb malaria, with almost zero attention to any other disease infecting and affecting the poor. We can and we should rejoice that about $53 million has been raised, and with a $75 million goal in hand in order to fight malaria. I sit on one committee, and just this week voted to purchase $1.5 million worth of malaria nets for the country of Sierra Leone. And I celebrate that. But the sad part is that a week prior, the committee I co-chaired, the United Methodist Global AIDS Fund, had to vote to suspend grants because we had zero money in the treasury. United Methodist leaders care about combating malaria, but not HIV and AIDS. However, some of us will not stop. We will continue to remind the church that there are 34 million people living with HIV and AIDS, and that more people die of AIDS than malaria or tuberculosis every year. We will continue to point out that the United States has 1.2 million persons infected, but 20 to 25% do not know it, and therefore run the risk of infecting others. We will emphasize that stigma and discrimination, often fueled by the church, causes people to refuse to get treated, counseled, and get the necessary treatment that's available. We will attempt to awaken persons to the fact that nearly 50% of all infections worldwide are women, and that in the United States, 40% of the persons infected are African American. We will at least try to get the church to care about the 15 million AIDS orphans in the world. We will beg the church in the coming months to join the efforts to stop the transmission of HIV to 1,000 newborn infants every day around the world. Every child has a right to be born free of HIV and AIDS, and it can happen. Virtually no children are born infected in the United States because we have drugs and medical care to stop the transmission. But why doesn't the church want to be on the forefront of stopping the transmission in the world, at least in its own clinics and its own hospitals and among its own members? We will press our seminaries, sharing and asking if they too have forgotten the HIV/AIDS pandemic, except maybe for a limited mention in a classroom. How will World AIDS Day be observed on December 1st at Boston University School of Theology and other seminaries around our denomination? As we all know, the United Methodist Church, that I love so much, is bigoted when it comes to LGBT persons. We have been fixated on sexual orientation rather than the spiritual orientation of our people. We have been more concerned about people's sexual practices than their spiritual practices of love, and care, and mercy. We have failed to see that homophobia, not homosexuality, is a choice. None of us choose our sexual orientation, but we do choose whether we want to be exclusive or inclusive, judgmental or justice-seeking, compassionate or condemning. In the midst of the evil apartheid system, Archbishop Desmond Tutu asked why he always was so hopeful. He responded that as Christians, we are prisoners of hope. As Christians, we believe that God is at work in the world, seeking to bring life abundant for all people, and we are called to be part of God's liberating love. We at the church always have a choice to be either oppressor, or an incubator in the midst of cultural upheaval. And so I remain a prisoner of hope, believing in Hillary Clinton's image of an AIDS-free generation. Last month I was in Kenya with Bishop Catherine Muta, the first Kenyan woman bishop. The Center for the Church and Global AIDS had raised money for an integrated prevention system, and together we distributed condoms, malaria nets, family water filters, and deworming medicine to 1,000 people, and we tested nearly 1,000 persons. That church there is an incubator of hope because we have over 500 AIDS orphans being cared for by grandparents and guardians. We have 850 persons living in support groups, all generated and supported by the church and integrated in the life of the church. It can happen if people believe and if people give leadership hope. One group I visited contained a Muslim man who said in the course of the conversation, "I always wondered what Methodism meant, and now I know." He says it means love in action. When Methodism, and when the church becomes really involved in any crisis, in this case I'm talking about HIV and AIDS, the church can manifest hope and can be a strong force in our world. I believe we need, maybe not just exactly a new student movement, but we need a new commitment upon every part of every church member to see how we can make an impact. For today, we're not here just simply to celebrate the past, but to envision the future. And I thank you.
Wow. Alas, but Charlotte Bunch at the last minute could not be with us. So we do not have another speaker now, but we will have a 10-minute coffee break. Let me welcome you back from our coffee break. We're here for the panel on motive. And I'd like to give our thanks to the STH Office of Alumni Office and Development and Alumni Relations, especially to Ted Karp, who planned the program. And so we want to give our thanks to the Alumni Office for gathering this together. Now's the time for you to engage with the panelists. So what I'm going to do is just sit here and point fingers at people and let you get started in the conversation. Who'd like to go first? Yes.
Why?
Please introduce yourself when you speak. That'd be great.
My name is Kathy Corman. I have a quick question, which I hope will produce a longer answer. Will you just narrate the story of the closing down of Motive Magazine? Many people here probably know, but I'd like to hear it from you.
And so the question was, please, for BJ, please narrate the story of the closing of Motive Magazine. What happened in the shutdown?
Thank you. It can be a really short answer because part of the answer is we don't know. I have tried vigorously to find and talk with my successor because I've now discovered that though for a long while I self-identified and other people identified me as the fourth and final editor of Motive. That's not true. Robert Maurer, M-A-U-R-E-R, in 1969, summer of 69, was interviewed and hired to be, I think he preferred to be called leader of the editorial team. It operated, the group of people operated as a commune, literally, residentially, as well as journalistically. And there are copies of announcements and marketing materials I have read late fall of 1969 in which Bob, on behalf of his colleagues, identified the expectation that the magazine would continue to be published, but probably instead of 8 issues a year, 4 so-called double issues because they, and some of us previously, had found that when we did a quote special issue, a whole issue on one topic, particularly women's liberation, etc., that it had a lifetime way beyond the month. And so Robert Bob announced that they were going to go for thematic issues, and his earliest promotional material emphasized the environment and ecology. They never got to that point. I have now read his testimony that in the summer of '69, I mean, already Motive had ceased to become the magazine, the official magazine of the Methodist student movement, and it was known as the magazine, I don't think they use the word official, magazine of the University Christian movement, which was an ecumenical organization, but not an organization inside an institution. It was freestanding and having to obtain what money it could through national agencies of Protestant denominations. Within 3 or 4 months' time, they set up an independent corporation that on some letterheads is called Motive Inc. And I'm trying to find evidence, I'm trying to find the incorporation, and I haven't found it yet. The staff then decided, I think representative of the leadership in the commune, that they wanted to do a double issue on homosexuality. And as I read a little bit of the correspondence, there was such incredible disagreement in the commune that they decided the women had to do their own issue and the men had to do their issue. So the last 2 printed magazines under the name Motive were separate gay issues. And even if they had still been the property of the Methodist Church, it would have led to their dissolution. It took 2.5 years before they finally shut the doors to the building they occupied. They did a couple of garage sales and sold everything that was the remainder of the property. And they turned over the subscription list of Motive, which I think then was down to no more than 10 or 12,000. They turned it over to Liberation magazine as a gift, and Liberation sort of succeeded Motive ability to sell the magazine. If any of us can find Robert Maurer, Joanne Cook, Jim Stencil, we'll be able to give a lot more accurate and insightful answer. So far, don't know where they are.
Thank you.
You mentioned the low end of
Please
subscription.
introduce
Oh,
yourself.
sorry. It's John Poole from the Library of Congress. You mentioned the low end of the subscription level. What was it at the top end, and when was that?
By the mid-'60s, my colleagues and I had grown the paid membership to over 40,000. It was hard work. And also, I went into Motive very inexperienced, very insecure, and I went in because I was a product of the Methodist student movement. I was at the board at age 26 as what we would call a junior management intern. And I was editing a monthly newsletter called the MSM Bulletin. And Jameson Jones, my predecessor, who was the 3rd editor, Jameson was editor for only 3 publishing years, and accepted an invitation to go to Evanston on the faculty there. I am going to tell this, or I'll do it real quickly. Jamie resigned in either April or May of '69. I physically left, 60. In the summer of '60, my immediate boss called me into the office and said, blah, 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 blah. And we don't have time to do a national search, so we're inviting you to become the acting editor of Motive. And in addition, you'll do the MSM Bulletin, and you'll continue to do, I mean, I still carried all of my prior job assignments. I was 27 years old, and I adored this magazine. It had framed my gestalt, my image, everything. And I was so overwhelmed, I thought, let me think about it. So I went home. My former wife, was a really committed spouse, mother, etc. I walked in the door and she said, well, how was your day? And I said, well, kind of interesting. They asked me if I will be acting editor of Motive. Claudia, very often on any big question, much like my current husband, Steve McCullough, she would say, well, that's an interesting question. What do you think? Or, well, let me tell you about what I did today. She never really bit the bullet. So I said, I want to be acting editor of Motive. And she almost yelled and uttered a four-letter word and said, why would you do that? And I thought, and I said, well, you know, you like Motive. I said, no, that's wonderful. You're a great editor. You couldn't be an acting caretaker. You know, either you're going to do it or not do it. And it really dawned on me, wait a minute. This is a really transitional moment in the life of the student movement of the magazine. And nobody could step into that chair with its history. 10 years of Harold Aaronsburger, 8 years of Roger Barkmeyer, 12 years of Peg Rigg, Hodge O'Crane. You know, the magazine had such cachet. And so I said, no, that's correct. That'd be bad for everybody. So I went back the next day and had a meeting with my then boss. Well, it's a big honor, but you can't do that. And he was really startled. Because I've always been a nice guy. I pretty much did what needed to be done. And he said, well, is there something wrong about the offer? And I said, Kyle, it's everything. The magazine deserves an editor, not an acting editor. And you deserve somebody sitting in that chair who will take responsibility. And you can hire me or him or her conditional upon a year's evaluation, or you can hire without a lifetime commitment. But you have to keep the ball rolling, and you cannot let the readership of the magazine down. We'll get back to you. About a week later, I got called in and said, well, we thought about it, and on most points, you're right. We'll sign an agreement. We won't say it publicly. We'll sign an agreement for a year. In 6 months' time, you'll know whether it's the right for you, and we'll certainly know whether it's right for us. And he said, you know, in 6 months' time, if we have to do a national search, we can do it. So that was, out of all the correspondence I have uncovered, I can't find that letter. I can find everything else, but I can't find the official letter. Because I'm pretty sure it also set up a quarterly meeting of an advisory board. I mean, there was a lot of supervision that was, for good reason. Anyway.
Yes.
My name's Odette Lockwood Stewart, and I come from Berkeley, California. I'm an alum. And this is kind of reflection. Number one, thank you so much. I didn't realize walking in how deeply powerful this experience would be. And I really appreciate it being contextualized in the social history. And what came to me as everyone was speaking is the relationship between incubation and the diminished investment of the church in incubation and moving to oppression, and not only opening children and youth to the world, but staying open to children and youth in the church. And when I came to BU in 1974, religious education was no longer a requirement for the Master of Divinity. And when I became a campus minister in 1979, the student movement was not happening. And in 1987, when there was an effort to restart the United Methodist student movement, there really was disinvestment all the way along, including my generation, and critiquing the upcoming generation. And I would be really interested in reflections on that, on this whole, I loved your choice of incubation and oppression and each of your experience of that, and just any reflections you have on kind of, I know there's a lot of disinvestment in education, disinvestment in new generations and all of that, but in terms of that era and the era immediately following Motive and campus ministry, Gil, I know you've been involved for a long time too, if you had any reflections on that.
I think that's a wonderful question, and I think each person can address it because it really is about the church at large and the youth activities and faculty. And I will respond. Ted?
Could you restate the question for
sorry.
our web audience?
Yes, the question is about why did the United Methodist Church or the mainline churches in general disinvest themselves from youth education and support of teenagers and campus ministries at that key historical moment of the early 1970s? Why the collapse of attention toward young people?
About the magazine itself, the accusation against me was that I had led the readership leftwards into the world of secularism and led people out of the church. Whether true or not, I couldn't have led anybody out of the church. The church did a quite good job of doing that itself. It was a time of declining everything, declining membership, declining money, and a different kind of executive leadership. I mean, Don spoke eloquently about what it's like to move to the other side of the table and be the person who's responsible for the institution. By 1970, I doubt that any higher education administrator or head of United Way or the Democratic or Republican parties wanted to necessarily be in charge of anything. We were a country in major anti-institutional thinking behavior. Anyhow, it was an era of decline, an era of enormous celebration of independence and huge civil breaks in society. I mean, I think in 8 years' time I may have printed 3 4-letter words 2 or 3 times. 4-letter words were the essence of vocabulary on the Tonight, look at American cinema, look at American drama. I mean, the world had moved so much out onto the broad arena of life, and we won't even talk about sexual politics. So why would a major institution, particularly in the Methodist Church, establish a beachhead in almost any area, perhaps other than international relations or global relationships, but more in a colonial way than independent?
Would someone else like to address the question?
Yeah, I would.
Use the mic.
Use the microphone.
Just trying to frame my answer here, but I was able to interview both Margaret Flory, who headed student ministries for the Presbyterians, and Ruth Harris, who did that for the Methodists. And both of them came quite close to being fired entirely. And their supporters made sure that didn't happen. But Margaret did end up at a retreat center, basically, at the very margins of things. And both of them, in their own way, described the fury of the church discovering that youth and student ministries was not replicating themselves. They had not really been paying any attention. They just had assumed that that's what was happening in the basement. Was more of whatever they were was being, and to wake up and discover that something quite different was happening, that they believed would not have happened. Their children would not have asked these questions, would not have taken these stands, would not have become so annoying if the church leadership had not corrupted them, as they say, that they just wanted no parts of it. Well, if you're not going to make more, if you're not going to replicate, we don't want to give you money at all. And that anger led to punishment almost. Okay, we'll just pull the plug.
May I try that?
Yeah.
I'm going to, in response to that, to weave in something that I was thinking of incorporating in my presentation. I've attempted to figure the abstinence history of Methodism on not only alcohol, smoking, dancing, sex before marriage. I'm attempting, because I look at the negative impact that had on my life across the board. And I realized that the church and I may have been doing what might have been the right thing for the wrong reasons, which therefore was not in depth. And I guess I find myself reflecting on how I responded to that kind of abstinence mentality, abiding by it, but then discovering that as I became a man, there was something missing because I was holding back for the wrong reasons. And therefore that sort of had its impact. And I don't know whether does this touch base with anybody in terms of where if there's an abstinence mentality, which therefore negates the legitimacy of a bunch of things, but therefore should say the idea that this is losing control, because in fact there's a possibility that there will not be replication in terms of our abstinence mentality. And any more comments on that? Am I right on a little bit? Do people understand without going further? Mm-hmm. You don't want to hear about my sex life, do you?
Well, let me ask a question. By the 1980s, how many daily newspapers and national magazines had a religious beat? In the 60s, you heard the quotations from Newsweek, Time Magazine, New York Times. I mean, religion in the 60s, even though God was dead, religion was a lively, vital subject, often from a conservative, negative point of view. But by the 1980s, journalistically speaking, religion had disappeared.
Christmas and Easter editions.
Let's just say something.
I'm not sure. I don't think I've spent much time reflecting on life. I tend to just keep moving ahead. So I don't know that I have any insights. I suspect that the Methodist Youth Fellowship collapsed before the Methodist Student Movement. At least when I emerged out of seminary, it suddenly wasn't the way when I left 6 years before. And so 63, 69. So something happened. The two were related, I believe, but I don't know them all. But your research will show. But I think the others was a time of, we used to use the term generation gap. There was a huge generation gap at that moment in time. I know that from my own family experience, my life versus my parents' life. changes in society. The Vietnam War you have to play in here much bigger than we did today. That was an enormous factor in separating the young from the old. Tensions and pressures of that, which went late 60s through 70s. That really separated the generations.
Let's take another question. John.
John Berthrong. I found this absolutely fascinating. I'm the generation back of you guys. And for accidental reasons, as a kid from Oklahoma, I ended up spending a year in Hong Kong in 1964-65. So when I came back to the University of Oklahoma, I cheerfully became an SDS organizer. And the place that housed us was the Wesley Foundation. The place that housed us. I must have used tons of their, remember those old mimeograph machines? I must have used gallons of things churning out our anti-war, and it was close enough in time to the civil rights movements. We still saw those connections, and you know, as a young activist, it's hard to say how I related to the minister. You know, actually, since he was so nice to let me in there, I didn't capture him and, you know, put him in his office for 4 or 5 days just for the fun of it, because he basically housed us. And then a couple years later, I went off to the University of Kansas to finish my degree, and then I came back, you know, visit my father was a professor at the University of Oklahoma, so I must have come back before I went off to seminary in 69 or 70. And found that guy had been fired. And believe me, the person who had taken it over wouldn't even let me in the building. I mean, it was, you know, they had discovered what this guy, my sorrow, I can't remember his name. He was just the Wesley chaplain, you know, the guy who kind of protected. I didn't realize how much he protected us. But, you know, they got rid of him so fast. I don't know what, you know, cattle ranch they dumped him on in western Oklahoma, but it just changed. And, you know, at that point, in the generational thing, you know, it never would have occurred to me, even when I was off in seminary, that I would have anything to do, you know, all of those institutions that had existed in the formal church, from my point of view, were gone. Now, whether that was true or not, of course, who knows, but I just remember that absolutely dramatic moment of saying goodbye to him and then going back and being met at the door by the guy who knew who I was and said, "You can't even come in here. We don't want your kind here anymore."
I particularly miss Charlotte Bunch right at this moment, because Charlotte could address the question historically and politically very crisply. And I particularly miss her mentality as a young woman reared in the creativity of the Methodist Church, who had to leave religion at the church in order to be the woman she is today. But given that she's absent today, I do hope you'll invite her back here to deliver a lecture on this subject, because she would be eloquent and students and faculty would be enhanced by what she would say in response to that question.
Mary Elizabeth Moore. My bottom line question is, to what extent was the shift the result of the true power that youth had, youth and young adults, within the church and within the society? And I say that as someone who was in college during the years you were editing Motive magazine, and who, after I finished my graduate work, went to do youth ministry for several years. And when we expanded the youth ministry to be very diverse and include young people from all different classes and ethnicities and so forth, the pressure was really on me to tame the youth. It was I was expected to be domesticating in my approach to youth ministry. So and these were good people. They weren't doing this out of some kind of strangeness, but it was more of a cultural phenomenon, I think, and a shift. So to what extent was the actual resistance or churn affected by the effectiveness that the youth of earlier generations had had?
The question is, could the break in generations actually have to do with the effectiveness of the youth in moving in another direction?
I remember Charlotte as a student, probably in '66, being a youth representative on some advisory commission, and one of the most liberal bishops in the church patronizingly said, well now Charlotte, in a few years you will see that differently, and in a few years you will, and she interrupted and she said, Bishop, blah, 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 blah. I don't have a few years. It's now or never. And I say that anecdote because there was a immediacy to almost every question you were dealing with. And the temperament was, I have a life and it's legitimate. And I'm going to act on it whether you like it or not. Parents with any. There was very little place anywhere in society that there was a willingness to be patient. And the more the media covered us in Berkeley, the more visibility we got, the more awards we got for doing what we were doing. Those were really empowering, very establishment validation that you're not stupid, you're not necessarily wrong, it's okay. When I came back to Nashville, having won the second highest award in magazine industry, I got hosted at a coffee break.
Could I ask Dana a question? Historically, has there been, as you look at history, have there been other moments like this as you look at?
Yes, and often the question, often periods of war and upheaval cause a generational break where everything looks entirely different afterward. So, for example, prior to World War I, people were arguing for the superiority of Christianity based on its ethical superiority. Mid-World War I, it was really clear that Christians were no more moral than anybody else, and it completely pulled the rug out from under a whole set of ethical arguments. You had a similar break, I think it was the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement combined, that essentially blew up a whole generation. And then those folks left the church and stopped mentoring the people my age. And I was in the next generation, and we had no mentors of people slightly older than we were. A historical analysis of what happened to mainline campus ministry at that point also point to shifting theologies, which is the same thing that happened in the mission movement, and shifting theology, say, toward something called Christian presence, for example. The idea that the purpose of the university student movement is to just be there in solidarity with the students. And in retrospect, that has been exposed or critiqued as an elitist theology that assumed that college students knew what it meant to be a Christian already. So my own experience of campus ministry in the mid-'70s was that there was a huge Baptist student union, a huge campus crusade, a huge Catholic movement, and a tiny little combined Methodist and Presbyterian campus movement. And our minister would do things like join protest movement on campus and serve Ritz crackers and Coke in order to be contextualized in communion. Okay, so there was, a sense of a shift to another kind of theology that then was not supportive of formation of youth, because a whole generation of youth blew up the student movement. Now, that's the perspective from the slightly next generation as to what happened right before my age group. So there are historical studies of how that whole period just created kind of a psychic break in the youth movement.
I just want to add a tiny bit of a tiny story that fleshes that out a little bit. In the post-World War I student movement blow up. The Young Turks that stood up, stopped the convention, took the platform, told their elders to shut up, were named Reinhold Niebuhr, Henry Van Dusen, John Bennett, and Georgia Harkness, and they were every bit as furious as the post-Vietnam generation. So why did the whole thing disappear then? Well, Sherwood Eddy, who was a first-generation guy, had by that time become wealthy. Now, he was not a high-living guy. He just took his money and did interesting things with it. And one of the interesting things he did was put all these pissed-off kids on a boat and take them to Europe together, and in something called the American Seminar. And what that did, and then when they'd tour and they'd meet, he attached them basically to the broader student movement world. But he made a generational cohort out of them. Now, neo-Orthodox theology grew out of something called the Theological Discussion Group, which a core of 32 of these people formed in order to think deeply, theologically together about what made more sense.
Yes.
Walter Fluker, Boston University School of Theology. Are there parallels, contemporary parallels? And I'm asking this for students. I'm asking this question because it's clear to me that it could be Vietnam, but I'd like to use dangerous language, but sometimes called post-civil rights movement, especially among African Americans, but I think there's carryover to post-Vietnam. It appears to me that we have at least two, maybe becoming 3 generations of young people in general, some are students, who've arrived on the stage of history without memory, without lines. And when you do arrive on the stage without your lines and memory, you are either an ancient stutterer or you are highly improvisational. Do we see any parallels? Are there breaks and discontinuities with what's going on now? Because you really don't have the same kind of attachment to educational institutions or to institutional religion, so to speak, that you would have had in those early years.
Professor Fluker is asking a couple of questions. One about whether there are contemporary breaks in youth culture that are leading us into an perhaps anti-institutional direction, and also what do we do about the loss of memory of several generations of students who don't remember any of an era in which students were active, in these life and death issues. Sorry, I'm paraphrasing, but.
As part of my graduate student responsibilities here, I did undergraduate TA work in the Department of Religion. And it was, and I've also done youth ministry in the church for ages. And it was illuminating on exactly the questions you were asking. One big motivation for Boston University undergraduates to take religion is because they don't know anything, because they lack that kind of language. And in the wonder and glory of undergraduate religion at BU is our community is such a diverse one. In our classrooms, they discover other young people who have not been similarly deprived. And that is shocking, motivating, exciting, it was not unusual to have the student in tears in the office, being emotionally overwhelmed by the absence and desire for this kind of thing. Particularly instructive to me was I did 2 semesters with Steve Prothero as the assistant in his Death and Immortality class. And his first assignment in that class to just kind of push people into the deep end of the pool is to write their own funeral. Now that's not a graded assignment, but what was so shocking to me was both of those semesters I had students who so lacked a vocabulary, a way of even thinking about these questions, that they could not even begin, even for the kind of archetypical kind of, we'll have a beach party and throw the ashes in, which is what most of them wrote about. But the good news, and this is what inspired me, is every semester I had Jewish students who had, here at Boston University, rediscovered something their family had lost. And was able to articulate. So it's not impossible.
I believe that this break is happening right at the moment. If my timing is correct, tomorrow a stalwart champion of civil rights and prophetic leadership in the church, United Methodist Bishop Talbert, will perform a same-sex marriage in Alabama, and the executive committee of the Council of Bishops of the United Methodist Church in essence condemned him for doing that, and after it happens, there will be a further press releases and what the Council of Bishops will try to do with Bishop Talbert. And there we'll see the great gap between, especially the young, as we know in polls, but among others in our society, we're going to say the United Methodist Church is simply out of it. It doesn't understand what's happening, and our bishops are caught up. They're trapped by church law, but they're mostly trapped by their own unwillingness to just say, we wish it would be different and we have to force this law or something, but they're showing little empathy or understanding, with the exception of Bishop Marianne Swenson. And so we're living. We don't have to look backwards. We're right in the middle of, within the United Methodist Church, of a major challenge and break and opportunity for something good and hopeful to come out of all this.
Could I respond to that and then respond to Dr. Fluker's concern? First of all, I was interested as the executive committee of the Council of Bishops issues its statement requesting that Bishop Talbot not engage in that activity in Birmingham. We read where Pope Francis has removed a bishop in Germany because of his lifestyle, his economic lifestyle. And I find myself wondering where is that spirit in United Methodism, and how, history is a little interesting to say. And I'm not a historian, but it's interesting to say that in the same week, or at the same period where Pope Francis is breaking new ground, that who are our episcopates are breaking new ground in the United Methodist Church, and that's a real concern. In terms of Dr. Fluker's concern, I think, and one of the things that's important is the parallel, as we talk about the history of motive, to be sure that we do not ignore what's going on within, and what was going on within the African American community at that time. And I guess, as I look, for instance, I find myself longing for the Black Panther Party. There's no semblance of that. Or SNCC. are the youth councils of the NAACP. And I guess I would say, and one lives with a kind of healthy paranoia. None of you know about paranoia, but I've been sustained by it. I wonder if I guess I'm a conspiracy theorist also. I'm wondering if, in fact, unconsciously, society is, in fact, cooperating in the suppression of modal style. I mean, I would say that the music industry and its misogyny, and of course the way, of course, it has, of course, grabbed a hold of young people of all kinds, you see. But I mean, is there any, can you identify any secular response that, in fact, is responsible for the current nothingness, if you would? I've sort of suggested where I'm looking at this from an African-American perspective, an African-American community. But I think you were sort of asking that, weren't you, Dr. Fluger? What are the parallels? And I just wonder if there's any comparison between the absence of young black activity today and the absence in terms of those, the majority, the white community. Whether or not there's something going on in society that's operating, that's affecting the church.
Okay, we've got several people questions. Okay.
I'm Chris Evans. I'm a professor here at the School of Theology. I guess what I'd like to ask, and I think Dr. Caldwell sort of pointed in this direction in some of the other comments, I want to ask you about this: how is the spirit of motive going to live on? One of the concerns that I have as a faculty member here, when I look at the fact that I am increasingly hitting that point where I identify as a baby boomer, albeit on the younger end of the boomer spectrum, and recognize some of the gaps in my experience with the kind of young people who are students who are under the age of 30. I recognize that in some ways they are living at a time that is much better than my generation. I mean, I'll just use the example of the fact that my son at his senior prom was part of a group that had gay and straight couples. No big deal. In a sense, way beyond where mainline Protestant is. What's the issue? They've moved beyond it. The question, I guess I'm putting this in the form of a question, when you look at the fact that it's not just the United Methodist Church, but it's mostly within the culture of mainline churches, I think of the line from the film Cool Hand Luke. What we have here is a failure to communicate. How do you see the spirit of motive beginning to, I mean, whether it's in the form of a journal, whether it's in the form of some online medium, in terms of art, in terms of popular culture, because that is one of the things, I guess, that Motive did so well. It wasn't this culture bashing that you see today. Motive embraced the culture, but they used it in a way that really connected with a lot of questions of faith and spirituality, and like Hillary Clinton, seeing the possibility of religion and social change. How do we begin to sort of take that spirit of Motive and move it and head into the future?
I've asked BJ if I could piggyback on that question.
Go ahead and repeat the question.
All right. The question first is how does Motive live today, or what ought it look like in terms of today's reality? And just piggybacking on that concern, I was going to ask BJ if Motive published this year, would it be queer theology, black theology, womanist theology, feminist theology? What would it be saying or portraying in terms of art or what's happening on the cultural scene? Just sort of piggybacking on that. What from your perspective, what would the pages look like today? What would be the themes that you would pick up?
It's very simple. It wouldn't exist. I mean, I feel what's missing in both the question and our discussion, of course, is out of the born. What is at stake is technology, communications, and industry. Your son and his colleagues were framed 10 or 12 years ago by whatever they overheard at home, but more importantly, what they saw and heard. And I say we wouldn't deal with it today because there wouldn't be print. There wouldn't be a magazine. We barely have newspapers. Look at the Washington Post. Who owns the Washington Post? And what will that do within 12 months to completely alter the reputation of that newspaper in terms of community? Anyway, today,
You remind people of what is happening to the Washington Post.
it was founded and owned by the Graham family, and it was really their printing the expose of the governmental fallacies in Vietnam, Woodward and Bernstein, that brought the government to a screeching halt. And now it's been bought by one man who's got $1 zillion that he made from high tech. So anyhow, I think today, this conversation, basically among the few people I know under age 25, they shrug their shoulders and say, who cares? I don't have time to deal with this. Those who may have time to do it will read their favorite blogs, or they may create a blog, and so it's really it's the level of instant reaction, communication, and some analysis that is framing our ignorance. I mean, why do I have to learn a lot of this stuff about church history? I can go to Google. Anyhow, I think technology, communications, this conversation we're happening over at the School of Journalism, you would hear complete revolutionary talk.
But where's the spirit? I still want you to come back to that question. I think Gil and Don were pointing to it earlier in their comments. But where is that spirit?
And if it's not yet, where can it be?
I just say it's an environmentalism.
Yes.
My son, for example, has just organized a whole teach-in in Somerville next spring where all these young people are going to be giving classes to each other all day on a lot of different topics. And he did that through using current technology. So I think those of us up here are not aware enough actually of how these new organization is coming out of the new technologies of the day. So I've jumped in, sorry. There are a couple other questions here.
Great. Well, my name's Dan Carmen. I'm 21 and graduated from the communication school, actually. But
I'll leave now.
I will say I agree, and Gil's earlier comment about abstinence in terms of if the will is corrupted, no matter what the end, of course it will not be good anymore. So it is definitely a question about where, not just the magazine industry, but the spirit of motive in terms of where it's heading. Because my parents graduated in the 80s from Cornell, and they didn't grow up in a religious family, but I did grow up in the Methodist Church to watch them being ousted from the church when they were on the worship committee and seen as radical for trying to change something and trying to bring about how do we make the congregation more whole, sort of in a conservative church trying to introduce liberal ideas. It isn't the time for moderate Christians. But my question then, in terms of where we're heading, is advice for the younger generation in terms of where would we see this change in spirit come about? Do we see it in terms of the people in the School of Theology and Harvard Divinity and Boston College? Do we then see it from the pulpit standpoint? Do we become the pastor and preach about this and mold a congregation? Or is it from Don's perspective in terms of going into academia, introducing it within the class? Or do we see it from probably like your mother, Gil, in terms of like seeing it from a sort of activist standpoint, but perhaps via nonprofits, awareness groups? How do we change the fact of, do we invigorate a spirit, or do we invigorate pockets of money for change in order to happen?
All right, Dan.
Question is, how do we make change happen?
Yes. Indeed.
All of the above, as
Yeah.
you just mentioned. I mean, but I think you have to find, for instance, School of Theology has its own distinct role. Make sure the spirit of motive is alive here. And pastors still have enormous power. They don't always use it. They're often frustrated. When I gave my kind of doom and gloom litany of what's happening in the United Methodist Global Aid Fund, the blockage is not the laity. The blockage is pastors. Pastors are unwilling to deal with these issues. They haven't addressed them in seminary, and they're not able to address them. Issues of human sexuality. They're afraid to. There's a lot of great fear out there. So if for example, a pastor in any United Methodist church, probably in the country, stood up this Sunday and said, "Let's take an offering to the United Methodist Global Aid Fund," the people would put the money in the collection. But getting the pastor to stand up and say that, they're just paralyzed. And certainly the bishops, the districts, they don't have the support behind them to do it. So I'm a theological educator. I spent most of my life doing that. We've not been able to. The seminary students are very prophetic when they're in the classroom and in the halls here. It's when they get out in the parish that they suddenly clam up. I mean, they're quite willing to protest professors and presidents all within the school, but when they're actually in the setting, they often get very quiet. Not all of them, thank goodness, especially in the School of Prophets. We have a history here of persons going out. But so, in one spot, institutionally, obviously we have to work in partners. And the great thing is there's so many great people out there willing to join in partnership with us for social change. I mean, there's really, you just have to go. There's agencies that, as Bishop Robinson said, God is working in the culture. Let's not forget, God doesn't just depend on the church saying that. Thank goodness. And so what we're seeing is signs of God in our culture. We just have to join in that liberating movement.
And Ted is pushing us, and this is helpful. I speak as a Neanderthal in terms of social communication, non-technological. I have no skills. I still have not developed a listserv. Each time I send an email, I type in manually each address. But the question is, even with this technology, how and who will provide that understanding of the scented water? That how, even with all of this magnificent technology, how in fact, and how does hope arise, no matter what the social media is, hope then that points to faith. As I was looking at Harvey Cox, he was suggesting way back there today that one of the things in terms of Marxists, having conversations with Christians, and I didn't read it deep enough, but in a sense, Marxists being intrigued with conversations with Christians because of the kind of endemic hope that was there that they did not have. And I guess the question is, even with different technology, how do you get the hope message through? How do you get the scented water idea out there using what is right now?
Well, a couple of threads. Ada, you were talking about student ignorance and young people's basic ignorance of rites and rituals, and I would add to that scripture. One of the most beautiful things I heard from the panel was this deep engagement with a bit from Job. If there's a way forward, and I think that there is, it's in some ways looking back at 1980 as much as 1970 and the Reagan Revolution and the stranglehold of conservatives claiming 100% validity and right and ownership of spirituality and scripture. I've got a rabbi whose best sermon this fall was about a liberal clarion call to reclaim scripture and scriptural stories. And that if we abandon our sacred texts and don't pass them on to our children and read them in the way that we know they must be read, then we are abandoning the possibility that religion gives for hope. So whether it's in Methodism or Judaism or Catholicism with our new Pope, it seems to me that one of the most exciting possibilities is to reach back to motive and to this incredible generation and bow down in front of them and pick up the mantle and go back into the faith itself. I'm just curious to know what you'd say to that. It's not really a question, I know.
Kathy commented that the liberals have abrogated their responsibility to continue spreading the tradition through Scripture to the next generation, and that needs to be reclaimed. And she's asking what do we think of that, and how do we do that?
I was really amazed when I went looking for the roots of the student Christian movement to discover an ecumenical spirituality, which you're documenting in your history of Barry. And once I saw it, like all culture's something, it's water we swim in, right? And I went back and I looked at the 6 hours of interviews I had done with Margaret Flory, and she mentioned all of the parts of it, but she didn't name it as this is an approach to an ecumenical spiritual life that I am introducing to my students. It was assumed, but I will tell you, it was also, because it wasn't named, it also was cast off without being recognized that it was doing so. So towards the end of the book, Church in the Struggle, about the ecumenical churches in the civil rights movement, towards the end, the historian's queries almost to himself, would they have all burned out if they had continued to pray every morning?
At this point, we've come to the point where I'd like to ask the panelists to each sum up, to have a final word for this moment in time. And we'll start in the order in which we presented, so except let's let BJ go last, to have the last word. So if we could go, how about Ada, then Gil, Don, and then BJ.
You're passing, giving me your time, is that what you're saying? This verse has been very important. I said in a pre-meeting, just to be able to sit with persons as I've been sitting with them, in the sense scholars rooted in the faith, has been just very, I miss this kind of gathering. I am a non-scholar. I'm certainly not an academician, nor do I think of myself in those terms. But just to be able to be present has been very, very stimulating, and to raise these kinds of questions. And then first to sort of to rub shoulders with BJ for in a sense, as I look back on my days in the North Carolina student movement, which of course were in the 50s. Now let's see, where was motive in the 50s? Was it, what was going on in the 50s back there when I was enough? Yeah.
Roger Wertheimer.
Okay, Roger Wertheimer, yeah. It just seems to me that I, even in those moments, found something in that magazine that titillated me, both intellectually as well as in terms of culture, the art, as a kind of artist during those days. So it's important. And I think I've heard someone suggest that there is a need to capture that motive spirit, first of all, to celebrate it and to give accuracy to the telling of that history, but then to see how do you bring that forward and how do you make it palatable to a new generation. And I guess I'm hoping that you will not give up on that BJ. That I hope that it's important that you of course I've exposed my age, and you of course are 10 years younger than I am, I'm sure.
I'm a year older than you.
but how do we as old timers, as we remember, help us sort of recalibrate and recommunicate, be interpreters, if you would. In fact, maybe that is the role, that there are some interpreters out there in this audience that are going to be able to make what we're saying out of back in the day live in this day. So I guess that's what I want to say.
Well, again, thank you for this opportunity to be here, for my own journey of self-discovery, to see how I was corrupted by B.J. Stiles without knowing it, and faculty and professors here at Boston University over the years. While I can look back, I tend to look forward, and I actually think it's the greatest time in the world to be alive. This is the best of times, not the worst of times. This is a time, there's a tremendous creative ferment out there. We're having a real clash of ideas in society, politically. Technology is changing. I don't know how it's going, but it's a time for new leadership and new ideas, and we have a chance to really increase freedom and equality and justice in the world. And although mountains are large, we are equipped to climb them, and we can equip others. So I dream equality for all people, and for the end of AIDS, and for end of hunger, and kind of poverty in this world, and for peace and justice. So, I think it's a great time to be alive and to see if we can mobilize our faith communities. Weak as they may seem, they still have strengths that we can share.
So Don, if you would just put that into a song and put it into a musical and get on Broadway like La Cage aux Folles, we would all join you in singing These Are the Best of Times. Today underscores for me something that I think I learned a long time ago. It's all about people, the people you choose to be with, work with, play with, study with, campaign with. We each, I believe, have heard today some person in our lives influenced us in ways far beyond what they knew they were doing. They may have been hired to be that Wesley Foundation person or that academic or that whatever. But we are where we are today because we have learned a lot from a mentor. In the last 3 years, I've had a fair amount of health challenge, and last year my medical institution invited me to be a patient mentor for 3 medical students. And it fascinated me to meet 2 women and one man and listen to them talk about why they were in medical school, what they wanted to do, how confused they were, and in each instant, every one of them had a role model. Sometimes going back to a science teacher in high school. But I met these 3 very impressive young doctors. On the next 10, 20, 30 years. There's a Tony Fauci, there's a Jim Curran, there is in my presence somebody who can absolutely change the world. So I am grateful for my mentors and my confessors and my helpers. And I encourage each of us to try to become that person to somebody else. We still have plenty of time to demonstrate. Secondly, I've heard a lot today that reaffirms my belief in that finally we have to do it our way. We do everything as part of a community. That community, in this context, is faith is church in a literal sense. Many of us left that part of the organized world and find our inspiration, our sustenance, our joy in being a real member of a different kind of community. I'm recapturing my relationship to this community thanks to this institution. But it's not going to replace the community that I live in 24/7. I say that because I believe that increasingly, whatever your career, our calling, our opportunity, we experience our rewards and we experience our challenge in linked arm in arm with some other people. They hear our grief, they hear our anger, and they hear our hopes. And I think it's just so important, whatever the medium of communication, communicate, but be open, be out, and be honest. I find that, I guess today, reaffirms, take your message carefully and fine-tune it into your elevator speech and deliver it every time you turn around. The world is too complex. As the Agile graphic depicts, it's words. A few words, well-spoken, well-timed, will capture attention. In the old days of vibrant newspapers, after the headline, we would sometimes read the article. Get your headline straight. And I love the idea of trying to get a teenager to write his or her obituary. What does your life mean, even if you were killed tomorrow? What do you stand for? People, community, and the message. That's what I take back to my experience, along with extraordinary appreciation to you for being here this afternoon, and to the dean, the chair, the scholar, student, development, mentor, guru. You and your colleagues have created magic. Thank you.